For today's tutorial, I'm going to show you how we can create this Deadpool and Grim Reaper mashup. So let's check it out. Hello and welcome to Blended Graphics, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jason Ortega and today marks day number 21 of 30 days of Photoshop. I've got a nice and fun tutorial lined up for you all today. However, it is a bit of a long one, so if you need to, go ahead and grab yourself something to eat, grab yourself something to drink, and get comfy. And we're going to start this thing up in just a second. Before we do start, however, I do want to just thank everyone that has been joining me on all of these days for this 30 days of Photoshop journey so far. I really appreciate the support and hopefully you have been getting a lot out of these videos. If you haven't done so already, please be sure to hit that subscribe button and click that bell to stay notified. If you also would like to see some more of my previous works and compositions, you can also follow me on my Blended Graphics Instagram page. Enough with the talk, let's jump into this. Alright, so here we are, we're going to turn on our first ground layer, and we're going to use this quick selection tool just so we can capture this sky. We don't need all of this, and if you hold on the Alt or Option key, we can actually take back some of this selection. We're going to now press on our layer mask button at the bottom, Command I to invert that, and then we're just going to erase this top line that was left there from our layer mask. After we transform this, we're going to scale this up. This is going to be our main groundwork that our characters are going to be on. So we just position this where we want to, accept it, and then we're going to bring in another background layer just to kind of help create that depth of field. And we're just going to scale this up just a little bit more. And then we can accept this. We're going to go back to our previous layer mask and paint black so we can erase some of this foreground that we have. And I've decided I want to keep this background layer instead of that little chunk that we still had from that ground layer. So we're going to erase that as well. Okay, and that looks really nice. And then we're going to go ahead and bring in our tomb layer. This was actually a 3D image that I got from Envato Elements. And we're just going to scale this up. I want it to be large enough because we are going to have Deadpool lying on it, and I don't want our character to be so small looking, so just try to find a nice happy medium. Okay, so we have that, and now here's our Reaper. And I'm just going to use the pen tool and create a selection of this. All right, and as we finish this, we're going to right click, make selection, hit OK, and then we are going to add a layer mask on that so we just have our extracted character from that background. And then we'll Command T to scale him up and move him down in this lower right hand corner. And then we're going to bring in Deadpool, and he's already been extracted from his background just for the sake of time. So I'm just experimenting with these two characters, just trying to find a nice perspective on both of these so we can get enough of both characters. And now I need to match the color of our foreground grass to the background, so I've added a selective color adjustment layer, and we're going to the yellow channel, and we're just going to play around with some of these sliders here, darken it up a little bit, maybe reduce some of that yellow, so that way we can get a better tone to match the color of the green in our background layer. And don't worry so much about how bright and saturated it is right now, because we are going to fix that here in just a second once we're done with this. So we'll make our final adjustments. And we'll close that out, add a hue and saturation adjustment layer, and now we can go ahead and desaturate this. Okay, and now we have a good starting off point for the base of our foundation here. What I want to do is I want to add a camera raw filter to our background and do some major adjustments with that. I personally like to adjust the sky and the furthest background first and get that to a good point that essentially we want to set the tone for the rest of this composition. And then we're going to go back to our other layers and then just use that as our reference and guide to help match those colors and the tone and the mood of our background. And here we are on our camera raw filter. Let's bring this temperature to the left side a little bit, reduce the exposure quite a bit, add some contrast, and we just want to darken this up. And we just want to find a good starting point for us to use as, like I said, a reference for the rest of our objects and layers within our composition. So we hit OK, and we'll accept these changes. And I'm going to go ahead and do some more changes with this color. So I'm going to add a color balance adjustment layer. I know I could have done this in the camera raw filter, but sometimes this just makes it easier for me so I don't have to keep going back into the filter and I can just use this layer. So I'm going to tweak these colors a little bit. It's all about personal preference and experimenting. I know I'm going to do this quite a bit more throughout the composition, but we're just getting a good starting off point. And then I'm going to add a brightness and contrast adjustment layer, and we'll reduce the brightness a little bit as well as increase the contrast just a little bit, not too much. And we can close that out, get back into our ground layer with a levels adjustment layer. And we're going to increase the contrast with this by bringing in both the highlights and shadows. And then I'm going to add a brightness and contrast adjustment layer so that way we can darken this up. There's many ways to accomplish this. I could have just used another levels adjustment layer or an exposure adjustment layer, but I've been liking the brightness and contrast one, so we're doing that. And we can actually create a duplicate copy of that color balance adjustment layer that we had for our background by holding down the Alt or Option key and clicking and dragging that up to the top in here. And now we have those colors already preset before, so that way everything's nice and cohesive. And since we already had those colors locked in to where they were, I'm just making little adjustments so I don't have to do too much with this. All right, so we're going to close these up and group them together by pressing Command G, and then we're just going to title this our background layer. And now we can add a hue and saturation adjustment layer, and we can just reduce this so it's not so vibrant and in your face. So we're going to reduce this just a little bit. And then we're going to go up to the top and go to the opacity and reduce that just a little bit as well. I'm going to go ahead and now add a gradient map to this. I told you I'm not going to be done doing the color grading to this background, and this won't be the last time of an adjustment either. So I put this in a blending mode, darker color, and we're going to go back into the camera raw filter of our background layer, and we're just going to brighten this up a little bit so it's not so dark. We're also going to increase the texture as well. So we'll do that, hit OK. From here, I also have some dead roses that I also got from Envato Elements, and we're going to use these on the ground. But before we do this, and I'm just going to put this on the ground, but I want to go back a second here, and we're going to switch our brush up to like a grass tip brush, and we're going to paint away on the Tombstone layer mask so that way it doesn't look like our stone is just floating on the grass and it's going to be more cemented into that ground. So we're just painting black on the layer mask here at the bottom and just kind of bring in some of that grass definition. And we can continue to rotate different brushes as well so that way we have a variety. Okay, so now that we have that, we can close this up and we can bring back in our roses. So we'll scale this down and just kind of find a nice spot on the ground here. And I'm probably going to end up moving these later on as well, just because I'm going to also bring in a lantern that we're going to also have on the ground. So we're just kind of getting a general idea of where to put these. All right, now let's go to a cloud brush here, and we're going to create some atmospheric haze, just kind of really build up this environment. I'm going to sample the color from here and just change the color slightly. And we're just going to go around dabbing, just creating this really eerie mood. I feel like if you're in a cemetery, you have to have fog. Like that's just part of the rules of doing a piece of art or a composition in that setting. And let's go ahead and change up the brush, find a different cloud brush to use, just so we can have a bit of variety. All right, so with our background layer selected, let's go to Filter, down to Blur and Gaussian Blur, and we're just going to add a little bit of blur to this background layer. We'll hit OK, and we can go back and just adjust these flowers a little bit. I told you we were going to do that, and we probably still will later on. All right, so now that that's been adjusted, let's drop in our lantern and Command T, and we're going to scale this down just a little bit here. And we can go back to that grass brush that we had for the tombstone. We're going to do the same thing, just painting black on the layer mask and help blend this into the ground so it's not floating on top. So these are actually going to be all of the elements that we're going to use with this composition. And so now that we have everything in place, we can start to address these subjects and objects individually and start blending them in with this background. And we're going to start off with the Tombstone. And I'm going to hide our Grim Reaper so that way we can fully see this Tombstone. I'm going to add a brightness and contrast adjustment layer and drop both the contrast and the brightness to this. Okay, now we can add an exposure adjustment layer, clip it below, and let's just darken this even more. It's still a bit bright for our environment. And with the lighting levels where I want them to be, let's go ahead and bring in my favorite adjustment tool, which is the color balance adjustment layer. And we're going to just move these sliders to help match the tones of our background. So we're going to stick with those cyans, the blues, the greens, and we're going to use this throughout our midtones, highlights, and shadows. And once we get this all set, I'm actually going to add another levels adjustment layer just so I can darken it up even more than what it is. It's not quite where I want it to be. So let's do that now. Add a levels adjustment layer. And let's bring in those shadows. And I'm going to make this more intense by adding an exposure layer on top of this. I know I probably don't have to continue to add all these extra layers. This is just the way I do things and how my brain works and operates. And I normally don't like to add any sort of lighting adjustment layers on top of a color grading adjustment layer because it starts to affect the tone of that. However, in this instance, I feel like it's not really going to mess too much with the overall look of what I'm going for. All right, now let's focus our attention to Deadpool. I've added a brightness and contrast adjustment layer just like our previous layers, and we're doing the same steps. And I'm a bit ADD right now, so I'm going back to our background layer, using a cloud brush, sampling some of these colors in our sky, and just creating more fog within this environment. I'm going to add a little bit more, and then we can bring back our Grim Reaper so we can see how all of this looks together with him in the picture. Okay. And with this round brush, I'm just going to do one little dab in this top right corner to kind of give us the impression that the moon is off to the side, but we can't see it. And I'm going to go back into the background layer, add a levels adjustment layer because I want to darken this up even more than what it is right now. The further I go along in the composition, my mind starts to change in the direction that I want. I'm also going to add a color lookup table. And sometimes I do this if I'm stuck on color grading or just want a little bit more inspiration. And this futuristic bleak actually looks really cool. So I'm going to stick with this, reduce the opacity. Okay. And I'm going to turn this off for just a second because I want to add a hue and saturation adjustment layer below that layer, sorry. And we're going to reduce the saturation on this so that way we don't have so much blue tones coming through. And we can turn back on our lookup table. Looks good. And I'm going to reduce the opacity on that even more. Okay, let's turn back on our fog layers. And now with those additions of the color lookup table, you can see our fog is off. So I'm going to group all of those layers together. And we're going to add a hue and saturation adjustment layer to this group. So let's add that there, clip it below by pressing Alt or Option and clicking. And then let's drop the saturation on this. So now it blends much better with that change. And we're going to have to do the same thing with the fog in the foreground. So we'll add a hue and saturation adjustment layer, clip it below, and reduce the saturation. Okay, I'm going to click on our foreground color, and we're going to switch that to white, because what I want to do here on a new layer in our background group is I'm just going to add another little dab in this upper right corner just to brighten that up just a little bit. Okay, now it's time to go back to Deadpool after that huge workaround. We're adding a levels adjustment layer. We're decreasing all of the highlights and Command I to invert that, and we're going to use that as our shadows. We're going to add another levels adjustment layer, and this time let's do the opposite. Let's go ahead and increase the highlights, brighten him up, Command I, and we're going to invert that mask. And so now we have our two layers here, so we can start working with shadows and highlights. And let's travel down here to his side here, and that's going to be furthest away from our light and closest to our tombstone, so that needs shadows. Under his arm, and I'm seeing he's not quite on that tombstone, so I'm going to press Command T and just drag him down a little bit. There you go. All right, now let's get back to work. And this is a very tedious and repetitive process, so I'm just going to speed this section up. All right, so now that the shadows are done, let's go to our highlights, and we're going to paint white on this layer mask. And again, we're just kind of hitting the areas that would most likely be in direct contact with the moonlight. And you understand the process, so I'm just going to speed this section up as well. All right, I now want to add a hue and saturation adjustment layer, and we're going to reduce the saturation on this just because I want to tone down some of that red in his costume. And now that he looks good, we're going to go back to our Tombstone layer, and we're going to do what we just did with Deadpool. We're going to add an exposure adjustment layer, really decrease that, invert the mask, and then we're going to add a levels adjustment layer for our highlights. So let's do that. And now we can crank up the highlights, and we're going to do the same thing. Let's Command I to invert that mask. And now we can start adding the highlights and shadows on our Tombstone. Starting off with shadows, I'm going to just hold down the Shift key and click again to create the straight line. I've added a new layer, and I'm just going to do all the way black this time just to really create that intense shadow underneath our character here. And I'm not at really high opacity. I'm just at 30% and just building this up. All right, let's get this elbow here. And then I want to put this into an overlay blend mode. So we'll add that there, go back to our shadows, reduce the opacity on that just a little bit. And now we can go back to our highlights, and let's start working with some of that on our Tombstone. And I'm really only going to add highlights just on that cross. And now I want to get to our Grim Reaper. Let's add a brightness and contrast adjustment layer. And now we can darken this guy up. So let's reduce that brightness, reduce the contrast. And because we're doing similar steps, I'm actually going to speed up this section here, and I'll see you in a second. And we're back. I'm adding a Gaussian blur onto the Grim Reaper just because he's not our main focus point and he's all the way in the foreground. So let's add some blur on him. All right, and now since he is set for the time being, let's move on to our next object and let's get to work on our lantern. We're going to add a brightness and contrast layer, surprise, surprise. And let's go ahead and reduce the light on that. We're going to darken this little object up. From here, let's add a levels adjustment layer, and we're going to increase the contrast. But I want to go back to the brightness and contrast layer mask, paint black on this candle, so that way it's still bright. And since we're here with the candle, let's add a new layer. I'm going to add a color here, and we're just going to find a nice yellow to work with, and just a little dab to create a glow and brighten this up a bit more. After this one, we're going to switch colors and just find a darker tone. And then we'll increase the brush size and then do another dab. It's unrealistic to have light on top of this lantern, so we're going to erase this glow on top. We can Command click on our layer to load up a selection. Let's even decrease this brush size, and let's try to really get in on some of these areas of the lantern. And as we do this, we're just taking our time, really trying to be as neat and clean as possible as we're erasing some of this glow from the lantern. I also want to paint a little bit on this candle itself to give it some light. Okay, and I want to create more contrast, so we're going to go back to our background layer, add a brightness and contrast adjustment layer, and darken this up a little bit. It just makes the glow of that lantern just much more effective. And because we darkened that up, I want to decrease the opacity of our fog, both in the background and in our foreground. So we're going to go to our foreground one now. Let's reduce the opacity on that. And we can go ahead and repeat all of those steps with our roses. So we're going to do brightness and contrast to darken it up. And then we can add a levels adjustment to create that contrast within that. And once we do that, we're going to go back to our lantern, and we're just going to add this new layer and find a similar yellow to work with. And we can create this overall atmospheric glow from our lantern that's going to be reflected off of our tombstone as well as some of our grass. Our fog is kind of in the way, so we're going to add a hue and saturation adjustment layer to our fog. Put that into colorize and just kind of get it to that yellow area. And then once we have that, we're going to Command I to invert that mask and just paint on that layer mask of the fog right there. And I do realize I am moving pretty quickly throughout this tutorial, mainly just for the sake of time. So if you do need me to explain anything in further detail or have a question about anything in this tutorial, feel free to drop me a comment. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. We're going to go back to our lantern, add a hue and saturation adjustment layer, and I want to change the glow on this. I just want it to be a bit more orange and not so yellow. So I'm just switching up the hue. So something right here I think looks pretty good for what I want. And since we're making the adjustment here, we need to do the same thing with our other glow layer that we added. So we add a hue and saturation adjustment layer. Let's click colorize. And now we need to match that same orangish tint that we have with our previous one. I actually want to intense this a bit more, so we're going to click on this layer, Command J to create a duplicate. And in our layer styles, we're going to go to our color overlay, find maybe a different color orange. And then once we're happy with that, let's hit OK. We're going to go to Blend If and bring in our shadows of the layer below on our anchor here. And in order to break that anchor into two, all you have to do is hold down the Alt or Option key and click on that. And that's going to give you a bit more of a precise blending. And then we're stuck with this glow on the Tombstone now, where we're going to have to make those same changes. So same thing, hue and saturation adjustment layer, and let's go ahead and change the hue of that. I actually want to go ahead and spread out this glow a bit more. So I've added a new layer. I'm trying to find that same orangish tint that we have, and once I hit OK, I'm just going to do a couple of dabs around here on the sides, like I said, just to spread this out. I don't have it set at a really high opacity at all, just really minor adjustments, especially when you have such a dark background, you don't need to have a high opacity. And let's just darken up this corner a little bit on that exposure adjustment layer. Okay, now let's go back and focus on the Tombstone, and we're going to add some highlights on here. I'm going to add a solid color adjustment layer, find a nice orangish tone to work with, put that into an overlay blend mode, and we're just going to paint a little bit on some spots here on the Tombstone just to make it pop a little bit more. I understand we already had an overall glow to this, but I'm adding some more light on there just for an extra bit of oomph. And I'm going to double click on our layer into our layer styles, and we're just going to bring back some of those darker spots underneath using that Blend If. I really love using the Blend If option a lot when I work with my glows, because if I use any of the other blend modes, it distorts the color, and I want to keep the tone the way it is. So this is a nice tool to work with that. And I'm going to go back to my Deadpool group layer, add a brightness and contrast adjustment layer, and I want to darken him up more. We're going to decrease our contrast as well as our brightness, and we'll just see a before and after a couple times here. I want some of that moonlight to come back, so we're going to paint black on this layer mask on the areas of the body that would be most susceptible to the moonlight. And as I'm painting away on this layer mask, I'm realizing that I want to add more highlight onto our Tombstone. So we're going to add another solid color adjustment layer. We're going to just change up the hue a little bit here. And maybe this time we'll go ahead and put it into a soft light blending mode. Yeah, we'll do that. We'll make sure it's clipped on there. And we're going to go to our previous solid color and we'll put that one into soft light as well. Okay, so now let's go back to our layer mask of our other one. Command I invert that. And we're just going to go over some spots again. Please forgive me, like I said, this is just how my process works. I just bounce from one thing to the next, so I apologize for being all over the place. Alrighty, so now that our Tombstone is taken care of, we need to start applying some of these highlights on some of our other objects. We can move back to our lantern. And before we add some highlights here, I just want to add some shadow at the base. So let's press I on our keyboard to bring up our eyedropper tool. Let's sample one of these dark colors on the ground. And we're going to use this as our color for our shadow, like I said, right below our base. And if you didn't see, I put this into a multiply blend mode. I think that always works really well when it comes to shadows. And we're just going to lightly go over here at a low opacity and just kind of build some shadows underneath our lantern. And from here, we can turn back on our glows and see how that looks. Yeah, it looks really nice. We can just touch up some spots here. And now I'm thinking we need to add a little bit more haze. So we can go back to one of our cloud brushes that I have. And let's go back to our color, pick something a little bit more yellowish tint. Just because we have that light from the lantern. And we're going to go over some of these spots just in the bottom right corner. Add maybe a little bit more white in this. And we really don't want to overdo it with this effect. What this actually helps create for us is a bit of contrast between our Grim Reaper and everything else in front of him. Just because right now everything is so dark, this just helps, like I said, create a bit more contrast and separation between everything. Let's now go ahead and move back to Deadpool and give him some of that highlight. So we're going to add a solid color, go back to this bright orange, and we'll clip it below. And let's find a good blending mode to use for this. So usually soft light or overlay works well. Let's do overlay. And we can invert that mask and just go over some of these parts that, like I said, will probably be the closest to this light from the lantern. And we'll ultimately get that reflected off the costume. And let's do a quick before and after. And he is definitely coming along. This whole composition is looking really good. So let's continue to move on. We can drop the opacity just a smidge. And we can add another solid color adjustment layer. Do something more that's going to be that moonlight color. And we can just add that next level and build it up even more. So we're going to invert that mask, go over some of this area on his left side. And we just want to just make that pop and stand out more than what it was before. And now let's go ahead and check out the before and after of this edition. And I realized we didn't add a shadow to our Tombstone, so let's create a layer underneath that, and let's find a good color to use for this. We'll go back to that multiply blend mode, and let's just kind of work around the base here. That's primarily where it's going to be the darkest, and just some little shadow streaks here at the bottom left corner. Okay, let's move to our Grim Reaper. We're going to add a hue and saturation adjustment layer. We'll clip it below, and let's click that colorized box and try to find that orangish tone that we have going on. And let's hit those arrows on the corner, Command I to invert the mask and start painting some of this in. And really this light is only going to be on the left side of our character here. And let's turn down the opacity a little bit. I want to now add a levels adjustment layer so we can boost up the contrast. Let's turn up the shadows, turn up the highlights. And then we're going to add a solid color adjustment layer for a second round of highlights. Let's go ahead and find a good blend mode to use. And Command I to invert the mask, and let's paint this back in. It's always good to know several different routes that we can take to produce the same thing. So that's the beauty of Photoshop. And now I think I'm going to darken him up a bit more. So let's add an exposure adjustment layer this time. And we can turn that down. And we can even drop the opacity as well so it's not too dark. Okay, and now we can finally move on to our roses on the ground. I created a new layer at the bottom, putting it into multiply blend mode just like the others. And we're just taking our time with painting some of these shadows underneath the stems and the flowers themselves. And situations like this, it can be really discouraging to take the time to do this, but I promise you it's worth it in the end. Be as accurate and precise as possible. That way you have the greatest quality product in the end. Okay, so with this grass brush, I'm just painting black on the group layer mask. And so that way we can sink some of these flowers into the ground. And that way it just helps us blend overall and not, again, have that look that it's just floating on top. Next, we want to add a levels adjustment layer and darken them up a little bit, create a little bit of contrast. Then we can add a color balance adjustment layer, kind of gravitate towards those warmer tones because of the light from the lantern. And then once we have that, settled in, we can now go ahead and add a solid color adjustment layer. And these will be the highlights, so let's find a good blend mode to use. Invert the mask, and let's paint some highlights on these flowers. And you know what I'm going to do? Let's click on that group layer, hit Command T, and we're going to drop this down just a little bit. And let's go back to our highlights. And now we can add an exposure adjustment layer, and we're going to really reduce the brightness on this. Drop that down, invert the mask, and let's paint more shadows in on these flowers. I'm going to go back to our hue and saturation layer, and we're going to decrease the saturation more on these flowers. So something right here looks good. And then I'm going to go back to our shadows and highlights and just do some final tweaks with these flowers. So I will see you in just a second. And I'm just wrapping up here, and figured you didn't really need to hear me speak through all of this. We're going to go to our ground layer, and we're going to add a hue and saturation adjustment layer. So we'll find that there. And let's go ahead and turn this into something orangish yellow, and this is going to help us create more of that glow effect on our ground. So let's just go ahead and spread this glow out a little bit. And then we can go back to our tombstone. Let's add a brightness and contrast layer, and we're going to darken this up. And I just want to darken some areas of this tombstone. We're pretty much at the end here, so I'm just kind of doing the final touches on everything before I send it through the camera raw filter for final adjustments. Alright, I think that's going to do it. So now what we need to do is merge all of them together into one at the very top. So at the very top layer, click on Create a New Layer. Make sure that new top layer is selected. Then press Command Shift Option E, and that's going to merge them all together. And then you need to go to, first we need to convert it to a smart object, then go to Filter, Camera Raw Filter, and that's where we are right now. And because this filter is so powerful, this is just where I like to do all of my final adjustments. So I'm going to go ahead and take care of that now, and then I will be back with you all in just a moment. See you soon. So this will go ahead and conclude our video for today. I really hope you liked this video. Thank you so much for everyone that stuck it out to the end. I know it was a bit of a long one. If you liked the video, please be sure to give it a big thumbs up. And if you want to see similar content just like this in the future, just let me know in that comment section. Other than that, thank you ladies and gentlemen for stopping by and watching this. I hope you drop by again tomorrow for another Photoshop tutorial. In the meantime, be safe and take care.